Thank you, Eva, and thank you, Norad, for having me here today. I think the topic I've been asked to speak on is how do you keep people awake after lunch? Let's see how that goes. Also, Helen Clark asked me if I've become a Vatican priest, and I had to clarify to her that, human rights is theology as well. But thank you. The topic, actually, I've been asked to speak about is how do we make sure that human rights don't remain normative frameworks, but also get converted into ground reality for real people. And of course, having traveled extensively over the last year to some of the most troubled spots in the world, there's no question that the world is facing far too many human rights challenges for us to be complacent. So this conference is very timely, also because tomorrow your new white paper is being released, which I understand is going to say that you're not going to cow down to China or Saudi Arabia because of economic interests. Very happy to hear that. But it's not just, in the obvious places that there are human rights challenges. When we think of human rights challenges, we think of countries in conflict in Africa or all of the Middle Eastern countries, the MENA region, or Russia, Ukraine. But really across a vast number of countries across the world. And the combination of growing inequality and a declining trust in elected leaders and leaders of the corporate sector, particularly amongst young people, I think is leading to just ordinary people losing faith in the mainstream processes of voice and participation and exploding into street protests, the latest example being Hong Kong. The irony, of course, is that as the street anger and disillusionment has been growing, it's running in parallel to the growing body of human rights treaties, conventions, and normative frameworks. They're almost inversely correlated. The number of treaties and frameworks we have with what we have on the ground as human rights being realized by ordinary people. I having worked at the UN before on the Millennium Goals, running the campaign there in New York for 7 years with Kofi Annan and others, we had one standing joke there, which was, in fact, which my friend Kailash has worked on for decades now, which is on the rights of the child. And so the famous treaty on the Convention of the Rights of the Child, there was one government, we were told quite reliably, who came to power, and they came to the UN and said they would like to ratify the CRC. So of course the UN folks opened the books and they found that this country had already ratified it before. So of course it's an extreme parody of how governments are so eager to sign things, but rarely eager to implement it. But I would be the last person to say that we don't need frameworks and normative treaties, etc., but obviously it's not enough. I'm happy that Norad has made this more direct link between human rights and development and democracy in this conversation, because the issue of embedding human rights and development and the fact that this leads to more equitable and sustainable outcomes is actually not really fully understood by most people. It's kind of mouthed. There's a lot of talk about rights-based development, but it doesn't mean that much in practice. And what better example do we have of that than the current debate on the post-2015 goals? I don't know how many of you have seen the new synthesis report that the Secretary General Ban Ki-moon has released. And I know that despite the best intentions in the UN, like people like Amina and others who are working on developing the synthesis report, when you see it, you'll realize that you need a magnifying glass to find human rights in this document. In the current version, you pretty much have it in the preamble and in one of the goals, but I wouldn't be surprised if as the negotiations go forward, even that disappears. And this is the paradox. So when I was in the campaign at the UN, the MDGs, when we were looking at success stories on the Millennium Development Goals, a shining example for the Middle East used to be Tunisia. Best economic growth rate, great beaches for Europeans to go to, most stable country. So very stable, very prosperous, and then it blows up. It blows up in everybody's face. And I'm sure the image of Mohammad Bouazizi would come to your minds. This guy who's a vegetable vendor who self-immolated. He set himself on fire. And he set himself on fire. He set Tunisia on fire. He set Egypt on fire. And he set Libya on fire. I don't know how many places it triggered. And it was very interesting because Bouazizi's story was that he tried to get a license to sell vegetables because he couldn't get a job. He was actually educated. He couldn't get a job. He wanted to sell vegetables. He went to ask for a license and the police slapped him on his face. And it was a loss of dignity, the lack of voice, and the lack of employment and livelihood. It's that combination which put in perspective this ridiculous discussion we have as to whether it's economic, social rights which matter or civil and political rights. You know, I always think that Bouazizi is a kind of the most classic expression of interdependence and indivisibility of rights. And of course, we've forgotten all the mantras from the Universal Declaration. And I know Jan Eliasson's most favorite quote from the UN Charter, which was repeated in the 2005 summit document, that you can't have peace without development, you can't have development without peace, and you can't have either without human rights. So everybody agrees. I'm happy we're all not, I mean, you guys are all converted anyway, you would agree. But I speak to audiences who don't actually know that much about human rights, and they all nod when I say this. And then, of course, we forget it. And I'm glad that our colleague from Sweden said that, you know, when we say democracy and Amartya Sen's development is freedom stuff, it's not only about holding elections. In fact, Amnesty International's position on democracy is that we actually take an agnostic view of this. Because to the extent that democracy is equated with elections, we have a real problem with that, because that becomes a great excuse for countries who have elections to abuse human rights with great, gusto. Because they say, we're elected, so now we can abuse human rights, So, and you can imagine the largest democracies in the world also, in volume terms, probably have the highest human rights abuses. So we have to be quite cautious, because for us, when we say, for us, the most critical question is, do we have the fundamental freedoms in place of expression, association, assembly, and do we have the institutions and the checks and balances in place? If you've not had an election and you've got all those in place, fine. It's the same with economic systems. It's not about capitalism or communism, because you have people use the political and economic systems as an excuse. So we say that's not an excuse. Doesn't matter what system you still have to respect human rights. But the question really is, how do we make all these rights real on the ground? So in a sense, I should just mention here that talking about great democracies and respect for human rights, we of course have heard from Snowden as to what the United States was doing, under the guise of democracy. And of course, the CIA report which came out, the Senate committee report on the CIA came out yesterday, that tells us about how robust democracies can continue to do whatever they want because they are supposedly democracies. But coming back to the question of, how do we convert this into on-the-ground action? And this is really bread and butter of what Amnesty International does on a daily basis. So in this city 37 years ago, Amnesty was awarded the Nobel Peace Prize for the work we did on torture, the UN Convention Against Torture. So Amnesty is the last person who can say we don't want the normative frameworks. Equally, after 2 decades of campaigning, in 2 weeks' time, we will finally have, coming into force, a UN arms trade treaty. It's one of big Amnesty campaigns. So we have that in place, and it's absolutely important that we have the frameworks. But take the UN Convention Against Torture. I'm just back from the Philippines. Philippines is one of those countries which is super eager to sign all these treaties. Signed the UN Convention Against Torture, ratified the optional protocol, but despite that, and they've actually now, 5 years ago, they instituted a very good anti-torture legislation in the country, which Amnesty worked with them towards putting in place. But 5 years later, you can be pretty sure that if you go into a police station in the Philippines, that you'll come out tortured or ill-treated or beaten. And more importantly, 5 years later, there's not a single person who has been convicted of torture or ill-treatment, not a single policeman. So the problem, of course, there is most of the people who are being tortured are from poor backgrounds, as you'd expect, who do not have the wherewithal to fight against the power of state security. Neither do they have the information on whom to complain to or the courage to complain against the police, given the culture of impunity. The great system in the Philippines is that if you get tortured by the police, you have to complain to the police. It's not really the brightest system, is it? So the key, as far as I'm concerned, or really the thinking we've done on this, the key to moving rights from the kind of the stratosphere to the ground, really is, the essential concept has to be of accountability and accountability mechanisms. So in the context of the Sustainable Development Goals, the post-2015 framework, if we take that as a concrete process that's going on right now, our message to the UN system and to member states is that 3 things need to be put in place into these goals today to make it real. First of all, none of the goals which are being put in place must go below the threshold of the existing human rights commitments and obligations that the states have made. So we could have a big argument as to whether there should be a separate goal for human rights or not, which is a good argument to have. As the foreign minister said, we need a separate goal, and goal 16 is kind of governance, scared to say human rights. It says everything except human rights. But whatever the wording is, the more important thing is every one of those 16 to 17 goals, are they keeping a threshold? Those indicators, targets, cannot be below existing human rights commitments and obligations that most states have already signed up to. Second is, we have to have effective monitoring systems in place, because otherwise governments sign and then they go back to the country and they've forgotten all about it. We already have existing mechanisms like the Universal Periodic Review and other human rights monitoring systems. This cannot be run as a completely parallel system to the monitoring system for the Sustainable Development Goals. We need to bring these two together. And the third, probably the most important, is that we have to ensure that there's legal enforceability at the national level for the goals. So what does that mean? That means, in the first instance, people need to know, so that the right to information, the access to information, alongside the right to justice and remedies, have to be built into it if we want to convert these goals into rights and rights into realities. So, of course, judicial and quasi-judicial accountability bodies, including parliaments, national human rights commissions, could be easily used as including regional complaints mechanisms. Because right now it's seen that that whole machinery is for civil political rights. It's got nothing to do with development. And as I said earlier, that distinction for most people in the world, for poor people, is meaningless. And the challenge in the next 15 years is not about how do you just achieve these goals, but how do you make sure that those who are excluded at the end of the Millennium Development Goal period, how do they get a voice? That's the challenge we have. At the core, however, of realizing rights for the poor and marginalized, as far as Amnesty's experience is concerned, in essence, it's about how do you create popular support and mobilize people to put pressure on governments. If you take the various success stories in the last decade or so, like, for example, the Treatment Action Campaign in South Africa, which resulted in access to antiretrovirals for millions of people living with HIV/AIDS, or the Right to Food campaign in my country, India, powered by public interest litigation that ensured free school meals for millions of children in India. Or in Europe, closer home, Amnesty's campaign for the implementation of the Race Equality Directive, which could bring housing and education rights for tens of thousands of Roma facing discrimination. The common thread in all this is also essentially the core of Amnesty's credo, that ordinary people coming together can create extraordinary change. And that for us, when our 7 million plus members, activists, supporters come together to pressure governments or corporations to do the right thing, we can see change, rights moving from law to reality. 3 months ago, for example, when the European Commission announced that it would bring infringement proceedings against the Czech Republic for systematic discrimination against Roma children in Czech schools, something we've been documenting for years, that's now moving it into reality. Almost 40 years ago, Václav Havel, living in what was then a repressive one-party state, wrote of the power of the powerless being achieved. Now, Amnesty and other campaigning organizations have successfully used the growing power of the media to supplement mass mobilization. But in the recent past, the new power and possibilities of digital technology, including social media, has become quite a game changer. Take the case of Syria, for example. In 1982, a long time ago, there was a horrific massacre in the town of Hama, committed by the forces of President Hafez al-Assad, the father of Bashar al-Assad. 20,000 people were killed. Amnesty wrote about this, but nobody really bothered or even heard about it. Today, with mobile phones uploading human rights abuses onto YouTube in real time, there is no place to hide. Even such a close country as North Korea is unable to conceal its secrets. We, as Amnesty, have used satellite imagery to reveal the growth of prison camps in North Korea. Our most recent anti-surveillance app might be of interest to some of you. It tells you if a government is looking over your shoulder. Our new panic button app is also becoming very popular for human rights defenders. It allows any activist under attack the possibility of alerting journalists, lawyers, and their families without revealing their identity to the attackers through a concealed app on your smartphone on the press of a button. But much of the credit for the Arab Spring, Occupy, and other street protests and revolutions has been attributed to Twitter, WhatsApp, Facebook, etc. And there's no question that the ability to quickly mobilize people onto the street and organize mass protests while retaining anonymity has been made possible through social media. But as most of the prime movers in the space, like Wael Ghonim, for example, the famous Coca-Cola executive in the Egyptian revolution, would themselves say before anybody else, that we cannot overrate the role of social media. When you go to Tahrir Square or to the Maidan in Kiev, for example, it's not a tweet or a Facebook page that's there, it's human beings. There's no substitute to human conviction, to passion, and to action. The people who occupied the streets in Hong Kong are not tweets. And even the all-powerful Chinese government cannot ignore, they can ignore 100,000 tweets, but they can't ignore 100,000 bodies on the street. So yes, we have a long way to go still before rights can move from statutes to real benefits in the lives of poor people, but the route to that is to educate, to organize, and reclaim rights. We have embarked inside Amnesty International in a huge program to challenge the premise that human rights is a Western construct. With members and presence now more and more, not just in Europe and the US, but in Africa, Asia, Latin America, and the Middle East. And by making sure that we're holding governments in the West as accountable as anybody else. So our work around the attacks on immigrants in the US and Europe is just one example. So building a global mass movement of ordinary people fighting for human rights in our assessment is the best way of ensuring that human rights become real and that governments and corporations truly have no place to hide. Thank you very much.